Hello and welcome back to the Java Beginners course or the Beginners series. In this tutorial, which is the fourth part of this tutorial series, we are going to be discussing variables. If you would like to start this course from the very beginning, then head over to the channel, look for the playlist and look for the JavaScript course beginner playlist. And like I said, this is the fourth part of this series and you can see the previous three components here. Ready if you want to look back on that first. So this does go step by step, but I have tried to chunk up this course into different topics so that you can just drop into different topics as and when you like. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you have a much better overview of what a variable is, how to set and create variables and how to manage them using JavaScript. Before we start talking about variables, I just wanted to set the scene. Typically, in a computer system, there are two types of memory, volatile memory and non-volatile memory. So typically in a computer, for example, RAM would be considered volatile memory because when we turn the computer off, anything that's stored in RAM will get deleted. Comparing that to non-volatile storage, for example, your hard drive, if you were to store something on your hard drive and you turn the computer off, of course, the data will remain on the hard drive. There are some trade-offs here working with the hard drive or RAM. We could generally say that the hard drive is slower at reading and writing data in comparison to RAM, which is generally considered a lot quicker at reading and writing data from and to the RAM. It's these properties, the speed in which we can store, retrieve data from RAM, is why it is very attractive as a software developer. If you've ever looked at the activity monitor in Mac or the task manager in Windows, you probably notice that you have a certain amount of memory, and that memory is being utilized by software that's currently running on your computer. So that takes us back to what I first said, that the most fundamental feature is the capacity to store and retrieve data, and JavaScript is going to provide us the tools to be able to do that. Now, we can, with JavaScript, store data on the hard drive, but typically, whilst the program is running, we're going to be utilizing RAM to store data. So that brings us nicely then into the question, what is a variable? So a variable is a name, an identifier, sometimes it's described as, that represents a value that's stored in RAM. Because yes, we can store data in RAM, but RAM can be 10, it can't be 12, 16, 32, 64 gig in quantity. So that's a lot of space. So how do we know where we've stored that data and how to retrieve it? And this is where the variable identifier comes into play. So if we want to store, say, the value 10 in RAM, we need to give that value an identifier so that we can then go ahead and capture that data or retrieve that data from RAM. So essentially a variable is an identifier, a name that represents a value that's stored in RAM. So if I want to retrieve the value that's stored in RAM, I need to know the name of the identifier for that piece of data. So as the slides suggest here, we're binding a name to a value that's stored in RAM. So it allows us to capture that data from RAM and retrieve it so that we can utilize it. So throughout the program that we develop, we can refer to that value as and when we need to via the name. In JavaScript, there is a little bit of terminology for us to understand, and it is slightly different from other programming languages in a few different ways. Now, I've used the word variable. So we now know that the variable or a variable is essentially just a name which points to data that's stored into RAM. But as the name implies, when we use the word variable, we're suggesting that it's variable. Potentially, this is implying that this variable can change or the value might change. So it's true to say that if we declare or if we create a variable in JavaScript, it means that we can also update that variable and maybe change its value. So for example, we want to store the value 10, maybe we need to do some calculations, and now we want to store the value 15. So here in JavaScript, we also have something called a constant, which is another type of variable. It works in the same way. We create a name and bind that to value, a data, and that data is then stored in memory. So we use the name of the constants to access that data. But again, as the name implies here, constant. So If we declare a constant variable, it's suggesting that this is something that is permanent. So this might, for example, might be important in some programming, in some programs. Take, for example, where you create a program where you're calculating tax. Tax might not be something that changes very regularly, so it's a constant value. So if we create a constant variable, a constant as a variable type, it means typically that that value won't change, it's permanent. The story doesn't end there. There are actually 3 different methods here. So we can use the keyword let, which will then allow us to create a variable in JavaScript. Now, ES6, as of creating this video, is the latest kind of version of JavaScript. And typically, let is the preferred way of creating a variable. So we also have this keyword const, which is going to enable us to create a constant. And then prior to ES6, you might also see in sample code var being used to create a variable. Now in this tutorial, we won't cover var, but this tutorial is going to be part 1 of 2, where we look deeper into variables, and we'll discuss that at a later date. What's important now is for us to have a look at how to create variables and how to manage variables using JavaScript. If you haven't followed the tutorial series from the start, you won't know potentially that I've already installed Node. And that will enable me to utilize the terminal here to actually run JavaScript. So go ahead and have a look at the first couple of tutorials if you're not too sure. Just download Node.js and get that installed. So I'm just going to create a new file here called example.js to create some examples. So remember, we are using JavaScript, so we have the JavaScript extension here. Let's just make sure this works. So I'm going to type in console.log. That's going to enable me to create some sort of output in the terminal. And let's just say hello world. So in order to kind of execute this code, I'm going to type in node and then the name of the file. And there we go. So we saw from the previous slide that let is currently the flavor of creating a variable. So we use the keyword let. Now notice here that this, my IDE here, Visual Studio Code, it highlights the word let as a keyword in JavaScript, so I can't use the word let to actually create a variable or named variable called let. So let is a keyword that tells JavaScript that I want to create a variable. So here, next up, we now know we have some sort of name or that's going to allow us to identify the data that's stored in RAM. So let's just call this username. So this is the identifier, the name. So I don't need to add any values at the moment. So let's do that. Let's say let username and let age. So at this point, what I've done is I've declared 2 variables using the let keyword. Now, remember case sensitivity previously taught in the previous tutorial. So if I use a capital here, I need to make sure that when I call this variable, I make sure that I utilize an uppercase. So it's completely different. So this is completely different from this. So it's case sensitive. Let's remember that. So by default then, I've created this variable. This is just a name. There is no data associated to this variable yet, which means behind the scenes, by default, the value of this variable is going to be undefined. So if I run this again, nothing happens. So let's do the console.log. And then let's output username, comma, and then age. So I'm going to output both of these variables, run this again, and notice here it says undefined, undefined. So I haven't actually defined any data associated to these names or to these variables. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to say that username, we'll just drop this down, username equals, and then because I'm utilizing a string, I need to put that in double, or I can use singles. And then let's go for age. Now age is a number type, so therefore I'm going to not need the double quotes here or the single quotes. So let's just put in equals 10. And there we go. So what we have here, and which I'll talk about in later tutorials, is data types. So this is we can call a string. So it's characters that make up a data type that I know is just text, for example. Whereas here, this is a number. So this is a different data type. Now, the importance here of data types is that if I want to work with numbers and words or strings, then the behavior of how JavaScript is going to handle these data types is going to be different. Now, at this point, we don't really need to know too much about that. Like I said, in later tutorials, we'll cover this in more depth. But for now, it's important just to understand that if we want to output a string, some text, they need to be in double. So let's just output this so you can see doubles. And then I'll just use it as singles just to showcase this and try this. And you can see the output is the same. So go back to the picture that we made earlier about storing data in RAM. What's happened here is that behind the scenes, JavaScript has allocated memory for this variable called username. It's gone ahead and allocated memory in your computer. It's then stored this string, in this case, in your RAM. And then in order to get to that data, we utilize this keyword here, username. So in order to get to this data here, which is now stored in RAM, we basically just need to know the name to access it. So this is a variable. So we do have to be careful when we're creating variable names or identifiers, because there are some reserved words. So these words are utilized by JavaScript to perform operations or to do some sort of task. So these are built-in words that we can't use for variable names. So if you go to Google and type in, for example, W3 Schools JS reserved names, that would take you to this page here, and that will give you a much deeper view of all the different reserved words that JavaScript has. Now, this is something that does change over different versions of JavaScript. So if you are going to move into JavaScript development, it's important that you keep up to date with the latest versions of JavaScript so that you can identify these small changes. One of the benefits of utilizing a program such as Visual Studio Code is it gives us a lot of information. So let's just take one of these words, say char here. Let's try and use this as a variable. And notice as soon as I try and do this, it looks like everything's okay. So let's give that a go. I'll run that and notice it still works. So this information here, in actual fact, is out of date. Okay, so if you look down here, it actually tells you about removed reserved words in ECMA script 6 standard. So in actual fact, char is now a word that's been removed as one of the reserved words, and we can now utilize it as a variable. So let's just take one that isn't, say for example, var. So we know var is another way of creating a variable. Now notice here that this IDE is going to recognize the fact that we can't utilize this word here, this reserved word identifier, as a variable. And you can see that I've got these red squiggly lines. If I hover over it, it's probably going to give me some information. So this is just one of the handy reasons to utilize a program such as Visual Studio Code. If you name your variables correctly, you shouldn't really come across these problems. So let's have a look at some of the different naming conventions for creating a variable. So the name must contain only letters, digits, or the symbol $ and underscore. So that's the real important thing here. If you're going to start to create variables in JavaScript, we need to make sure we follow those rules. The first character must not be a digit. So let's we can try this out, of course. So let's go ahead and try this. So let's say 1 char, and notice straight away that it indicates to us that we can't do that. So this is a number and it can't be utilized. So if I try and run this, we get the invalid unexpected token. So in addition to that, then hyphens cannot be used in the name hyphen. Let me just demonstrate that. So here we have char hyphen. So straight away, notice as soon as I use a hyphen, it gets highlighted, and you can see that that's going to cause an error. And the last few points here, like I've already mentioned, case matters, and then remember the reserved names. So avoid the reserved names. So case being, for example, if this is uppercase, so notice now that I'm not calling this correctly because it cannot, it even tells me here, it could not find the name. So there's little 3 dots here, and I've hovered over there and it's told me that. So again, this IDE is giving me this information. Let me just clear that so you can see the terminal. So if I try and run this, you can see that it's going to cause an error. So a reference error. So we've tried to reference username We've asked for the variable username. JavaScript can't find it, so therefore we receive an error. So obviously if I change it to uppercase then and try that again, it will be absolutely fine. There's no problem at all. So there are some code conventions because some variables you want to try and make them as descriptive as possible. So sometimes you want to use more than one word. So when you do, there is a convention, but there's a few different conventions, and this is just one of them. If we want to use multiple words, we could potentially use this camel case feature. So when the name contains multiple words, camel case is commonly used. So you can see this example here. The first word has a lowercase, and any word after that will have a capital. So just to demonstrate that, let's say new number. So notice that the second word isn't separated. We basically use this camel case format, if you like, and then the second word has a capital. So in addition to that, we may also use the underscore. So typically you might see these two different styles being utilized to declare variables. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to learn a little bit more about naming, variable naming. And this is something that typically you can't just find a book about. There's going to be sources online and you can read through them. And generally they all end up talking about the same points. Now, over time, as you start developing, you will start to see, once you create some simple programs, you'll start to see how important it is to think about variable names, because you want to try and make them as easy and understandable as possible. Now, there are many other reasons why that is not just for yourself, but for other people to read your code to make it easy for them to also understand. That's also important, but variable naming is important. So at this point, just try and make a variable name that has a clean and obvious meaning. So if you are storing the age of someone, call that age or person age. Try and make it something descriptive that really describes the data that's being stored. Just to further embellish on choosing the right name, try and think about utilizing human readable names like username or shopping cart. Again, try and make it descriptive and easily understandable by anyone who should be reading your code. Where possible, try and avoid abbreviations or short names, X, Y, and Z. And like I keep saying, make names descriptive and concise. So let's jump back into the code. Let's go through some different examples or variations of creating variables. So far, we've created two variables here using let, and we've learned a little bit about naming, and we've got two different data types here. So we now know how to assign that data to variables, and also using console.log, we've outputted the data just to kind of verify the fact that we are storing this data in memory. So we don't necessarily have to use a single line for every single variable. We can create multiple variables from one let. So just going, not following my rules, I'm going to set up x variable equals 1, and using the comma, I can now define a second variable, y equals 2, and then so on, z equals 3. So that's just a way of assigning multiple initial values to variables. I can go ahead and, of course, just print those out, x, y, and z, just to see if that works. And you can see that I've got an issue because I need to be careful with my uppercases. So I'm just going to run that again. And there we go. Just to show you a different variety or a different way of working here, we can assign previously declared variables. So let's just remove this. So we're going to say that x equals 1. So we now have a variable. We have the value 1 stored in memory, and it's referenced by x, the letter x. So let's go ahead and use a comma again, but this time we're going to use a multi-line. We're going to define a multiple variables in a multi-line style. So y equals, it's going to equal x. So we already know what x is referring to. It's the value 1. So here we're going to store 1 also in this new variable called y. So we're going to need a comma, and then let's say z equals, and let's also now say that z also needs to represent or equal 1. So we then refer to x variable again. Now notice here I don't use the trailing comma, else that will cause an issue. Let's go ahead and run this, and you can see the output is Xander 111. So we previously mentioned that a variable wasn't the only way of storing data in RAM. We also had a constant. So let's move now over to the constant. Now remember, the constant doesn't use let, it has its own keyword, which is COST. So this is going to allow us to define a constant. So remember that a constant is a value that we can initialize, and once we've done that, it is constant. We can't change it at all. So let's give this a go. So what might not change? Well, let's think about pi. So let's say pi equals 3.14. So this is just a value that isn't going to change in my software. This is a constant value that I'm going to utilize in my software. It is important to remember that this constant works slightly different from let in that you must initialize the constant when you declare it. So that means that we need to assign it to some sort of value. So take, for example, here, we had, for example, let username equals Zurich. Oh no, we're not going to declare something. Sorry. Right. So let's go ahead and say username. If you remember what happened when this variable gets initialized, it then returns undefined. But if we try and do that with a constant, we find that this is going to cause an error. Okay, so we must define a value, so or data type. So let's just assign this to Xander. Let's just output this. And apologies, you can't see that. Let's just bring that up. There we go. It does actually print out Xander. So we need to be careful to ensure that we do actually initiate a value when we create a constant. Now, another thing to mention is that you saw that I used uppercase for a constant, and that is a convention that some people follow. So if you do see an uppercase, that indicates the fact that this is a constant. Ultimately, it makes it a lot easier for you to identify constant in your variable, and it makes it a lot easier or readable by others. So at this point, we now know how to create a variable and a constant. We've seen some of the basic behaviors of a variable and constant in that we can define values for both a constant and a variable, and we can output them. We've seen that we're storing data in RAM, or by doing this, we are storing data in RAM and then retrieving that data. Now notice that we don't need to handle anything else. So JavaScript is a language which will deal with the actual allocation of the memory, actually putting the data in RAM. JavaScript is going to handle that all for us. Some programming language, we need to, for example, C++, we would need to specify a little bit more information in order for us to save data to memory. But in JavaScript, it's pretty much all behind the scenes. It's all abstracted for us, and there's nothing else that we need to do or understand about that at this point. So let's move on and talk about duplication, or the duplication error. Let's create a variable called x again, and let's create another variable called x, and let's go ahead and console.log this. Now this is going to cause an error. You can see it's already going to cause an error because I've got this red squiggly underline. It says cannot redeclare block scope variables. So just ignore block scope for now, because we're going to talk about that in a later tutorial when we talk about scope. But it's just important to understand that we can't define the same variable twice with the same name. Of course, we could do this because remember, JavaScript is case sensitive. So we can't do this. If we do try and run it, you see that it does actually tell us that the identifier x has already been declared. However, if you remember, we mentioned variable. The word variable is suggesting change. It can be variable. Maybe it stores 1, maybe it's storing 2. So we can actually redefine what's actually stored in our variable. So we can reassign or redeclare or redeclaration of a variable. So JavaScript will keep track, or the JavaScript engine is going to keep track of all the variables declared and the data that's currently stored in these variables. So let's go ahead now and create or update this variable. Now here we say let, so we create a variable. So now we know the name of the variable. So let's get rid of let, and let's now say x now equals 2. So what we've done here is we've declared a variable, and now we've updated this variable with a new value. So what should return is 2. So now we know how to declare a variable and print a variable in the terminal, and also now change the value that's associated to the variable. Now, if you remember, we said that a constant is constant. So once we declare the constant with a value, we can't then change it. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that. So in this case, this should cause an error. So notice here we said type error, assignment to constant variable. So it's telling us that we can't redeclare the value. This constant is constant. It's going to store, x is going to store 1. So this value is going to represent or return 1, and that's it. So we cannot redeclare it. Previously, we mentioned that we should be trying to utilize human readable names like username or shopping cart. So something else to think about when you're building an application is the terminology that you're utilizing, and utilize that terminology to help guide you create variables or names for variables and constants. So let's just presume we're building some sort of login application. So once we've decided how we want to describe the user or the user, however else you want to describe the user, maybe visitor, for example. So once we know the kind of terminology we want to utilize, we can then try and utilize that to expand our variables and create some sort of consistency or theme. So for example, let's create a variable using let, and we want to get the current user. So the keyword here is user. So everything we do will be based around the user. So we want to create a new user, so new and user. So we're just consistent with utilizing this keyword, but then we put the verb in front of it maybe to then expand and create that variable. And this is then going to create a nice consistency with all those variables that are associated to the user. I presume you get the idea there, but shopping cart. So let's create a new variable for shopping cart, new shopping cart. And then let's say update shopping cart. So you get the idea again. We're just using kind of a consistent naming style related to the object or the thing that we're trying to store information about. So that was part one of variables. Like I said at the start, there is more to variables here, and we will be exploring this over the next couple of tutorials. We move now directly into data types, and we start talking about different types of data types and exploring the different types of data types. Variables will be the mainstay for pretty much everything we do. Every program we build, we're going to need variables or constants. So this is kind of really key information that's going to help us progress now, moving on in this course.